there's very few guns that pretty much everybody in America is familiar with, and the AR-15 is one of those guns because of how much it is publicized, especially after some kind of mass tragedy. And that's what I want to talk about today as I give you 7 common misconceptions about the AR-15. Now, this is a really weird debate because you can know zero about this gun, but there's such an emotional response after one of these events that's a lot of times what gets argued is we need to ban them, and then the other side says, well, no, we're not banning them. And very few times do I ever hear any kind of like undisputed facts being tossed around. It's always an emotional response. Things start to trickle off, and then everybody forgets about it until unfortunately the next one happens. So that's why I want to cover this, because no matter if you're totally into guns or you're totally against people owning guns or maybe somewhere in the middle, at least this way you have the facts about it and you can make an informed decision for yourself to decide, is this really the demonic rifle that a lot of people claim that it is? Now, if you like the types of videos I do here, including topic videos like this, comparisons, 7 best guns, concealed carry, rifles, all kinds of gun-related content right here, consider subscribing. And if you want to support us further, you can do that on Patreon or become a channel member right here on YouTube. Gain access to some pretty cool perks. Let's go and get into it. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is how often these guns are actually used in crimes. Because anytime, especially after these, kind of mass tragedies happen, you will hear about the AR-15 and how terrible it really is. But we have to look at that in comparison, especially to pistols that are used in crimes every year. There's a study done from 2019, and they basically took a little over 13,000 unalivings, and they looked at each one of those and how those people were hurt. And so what they found is that 2.6% of those crimes involved the AR-15, but it wasn't just the AR, that's every type of rifle. Matter of fact, over 10% of the time, people actually used knives. And over 11% of the times, they used things like hammers. And almost 50%, I think it was actually 45%, of these crimes involving weapons of any kind, handguns were at the top of the list by far. So these crimes that happen in these tragedies are typically very heinous, right? Some psychopath goes into a school or something like that. But in the big scheme of things, the amount of rifles that are used are insignificant. And that doesn't mean that the lives taken, especially in those schools with children, are insignificant by any means. But every time one of these things comes up, you'll hear about this rifle specifically. But why? Well, it's very simple. The first one is the features on these guns. It is really easy to point out a gun like this. Well, this one not so much because it's actually an early 80s, but especially your modern ARs that people build out. And you can look at the features and you're like, oh my God, that's really scary. Nobody should have that. It's hard to do that with pistols, but understand that the action and the way this gun works is 1 trigger pull, 1 bullet. That's the way most pistols work. That's the way most rifles work, and even semi-auto shotguns. 1 trigger pull, bullet, or shot shells come out of the gun. So you can't ban it based on the action. They have to basically demonize the features in order to get the public on their side. But also, this is kind of a segue because this is one of those guns that they can easily demonize, especially after some kind of tragic event. And if they were to be able to get something passed that would allow them to ban these guns once again, like they did from 94 to 2004, which was an absolute joke, by the way. They only banned features that we were just talking about and magazine restrictions. It wasn't a complete ban, and it did nothing as far as public safety, regardless. If they could get something like that passed, then they could come back and say, look, that didn't have the same effect that we were looking for. Now we need to move to handguns, and then down the rabbit hole you go. And once you have one banned, you're never going to get that thing back. or let's just say good luck in getting those things back. And this is their barrier to entry. If they can get this, boom, everything else will just kind of fall in line. And that's why you see so much pushback when it comes to this, because once it's banned, you're never getting it back. Plus, keep in mind, you have over 20 million of these rifles that are actually in possession of gun owners. And, you know, anywhere from 250 to 300 people that are hurt or worse by every type of rifle in America yearly. So if these were the problem and the people that own these were the problem, you'd have a heck of a lot more of these events happening than what actually does. Again, don't want people to take that the wrong way. Every single one of these events is absolutely tragic, but at the same time, they do not happen as much as the media would like you to believe. And these rifles are not used in nearly as many crimes as they'd like you to believe as well. Now, another common misconception is the AR is so much deadlier than any other weapon out there, and that is just simply not the case. So what I have is a standard M&P 15, and then I have an M1A. Now this one actually shoots a 308, this is a 223 or a 556. Now it is true that the muzzle velocity of the 556, it moves really fast, and that's a part of its effectiveness, whereas this one moves fairly fast, not as fast as the 223, but the energy for this thing, not only up close, but also at hundreds of yards away, is going to be way more significant than something like this. And I find it really funny when people are surprised at how powerful firearms are. You know, they serve a defensive purpose most of the time, and in order for them to be effective, they're going to be powerful. You may be asking, well, why does that even matter? Well, it really comes down to the language used, because if they can talk about how much more deadly this gun is than any other, again, it's an easy way to kind of scare people into thinking there's no reason that anybody should have something like this, when for more than 100 years, we've been using rounds that were way more powerful. You know, the old methods of fighting during war had very powerful rounds like the 30-06, even back to Civil War days and even Revolutionary days, right? And so you would have, you know, two opposing armies standing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet away from each other, lined up and just shooting back and forth. And that's why before rifling came into the picture, which helps stabilize a bullet, you would have these really long guns like this trapdoor I have behind me. Okay, the idea was, you know, you had a powerful round, but now you need to get the distance out of it. World War I was probably the last war, the last major war anyways, where that type of fighting occurred. And then of course World War II kind of changed everything, you know, so nobody should be surprised that firearms are deadly, but the AR-15 is definitely not the most powerful gun out there. Now it's true that these are offered in multiple chamberings, but why would you be surprised that firearms are deadly in the first place? But you also have to consider the first thing I talked about when it comes to misconceptions. There's over 20 million of these out there, and less than a couple of hundred are used in crimes every single year, and that goes for all rifles, like I said before. So there's definitely not a crazy issue with the AR platform, and while yes, they are effective, they're also no more deadly than any other gun out there. Now, I'm just spitting facts out, and I love doing these types of videos. And, you know, one other crazy misconception is that you don't need 30 rounds for hunting. Now, by the way, I grabbed a little bit more modern AR, but I fully understand this is missing an optic. You know, I tend to whore my optics out when I get a new gun, which is why the Bren 2 behind me has the optic this one was rocking, and now I just got to get something to replace this one. But, you know, regardless, you know, this is another easy one, you know, because the information and how it's portrayed and the language used is really important. And so on the surface, you may think, you know what, that's actually a pretty good point. When you go deer hunting or something like that, or bear hunting, you don't need 30 rounds. Well, the best example I can use is actually hog hunting, which is promoted as something that, you know, states want to be done because of how damaging feral hogs can be. And feral hogs, especially females, well, only females really, travel in packs, you know, from 6 up to 30 or more. And coyotes, they live in packs. They don't typically travel in packs. But, you know, you could have multiple coyotes come up on you. Who knows? You could have a bear come up on you and you miss a couple of shots. I mean, your adrenaline is rushing. And unless you've ever been rushed by a deadly animal, you know, and seeing your life flashing in front of your eyes, you can't say how many rounds you're going to miss, you know? Everybody tries to paint like this perfect picture, and no, I've never been attacked by a deadly animal, okay? But I do understand how quickly that stuff, you know, could happen to you, and having, you know, an animal run up on me, I don't want to have less rounds. I want to have more of them so I can protect myself. And the same thing goes for attackers. You know, when you are attacked by a random stranger, it typically is 2 or more attackers that are there. Now, when somebody attacks you that is actually, you know, somebody that you know, which is very common as we know, it's typically only one person. But again, this is assuming that that person is just standing right in front of us and they're just gonna, you know, let us defend ourselves right then and there. You know, that doesn't account for potentially having to shoot through drywall or having to shoot through a door. How many videos have y'all seen now up to this point where you have people trying to break down your door, and then you all of a sudden you see shots just ringing out of the door because they caught them on camera and they don't even want them getting inside of the home? That is a very real possibility. And so to say otherwise is not being very genuine when you're talking about this conversation when it comes to the right to have your firearm and how many rounds we should be restricted to. I think it's definitely a disservice, because, you know, another thing that you must consider here is that, let's say they do restrict all of these guns to 10 rounds. Well, how quick is that? Yes, you will slow down the fire rate to an extent, but it doesn't take much to just swap a magazine out. It's very misleading when you say that people, you know, only need 10 rounds and there's no reason that you would ever need 30 rounds. Now here's another common one, that AR and the AR-15 stands for assault rifle. Now, you may have heard this before, but that is actually not the case. It stands for Armalite, which was a company that their chief designer, who was Eugene Stoner, worked for a really long time, and then the rights to the AR-15 name were actually sold to and retained still to this day by Colt. Now, the original design was not an AR-15, it was actually the AR-10. So essentially, after Korea, we were looking for a new rifle. Actually, towards the end of World War II, we were looking for a new rifle. And there was a number of different companies involved in this. But what they wanted to do was basically take an M1 Garand and add a detachable magazine to it. So they wanted to modernize their rifles and get away from the M-block clip and go to a 20-round detachable box magazine and give it the ability to be select fire. So there was actually 3 rifles that entered into these new trials in the 50s, the T-44, the T-47, and the T-48. Now the T-47 was kind of an interesting gun, and I'm actually going to be exploring how the AR replaced the M14. So I'm going to get a little bit more into that, but it's kind of a really fascinating turn of events there. But during the T-47's development, it was actually originally called the T-25, Earl Harvey, who worked for Springfield, actually came up with a round that was a shortened version of the 30-06, which actually came to be known as the 7.62x51 or the 308. Now eventually the T-47 did not do well in testing in adverse conditions and cold weather, and the T-48 proved to not be that good in really cold weather, and Springfield Armory also had the advantage of testing their T-44 in a cold chamber, so they did some redesign to the gas system and all that, and the T-44 eventually won those contracts, and they renamed it to the M14. Now, the M16 actually came about during Vietnam, okay? And so the M14 against the AK in that environment, in the Vietnam War, first of all, the M14 was just like impossible to shoot and select fire. And it was just too much for what they needed in that environment. So intermediate cartridges like the 7.62x39 out of the AK just proved to be more effective for the new type of fighting that was going on. And so eventually the M16 replaced the M14 for that reason. Now, of course, it took a number of years to have that, finally be adopted by all branches, but still, that's why we have the M16, which was later replaced by the M4. Now, I say all of that because another common misconception is that these are weapons of war, when they are absolutely not. They were sold onto the market as the AR-15. Now, the reason they're not a weapon of war, which is just another scare tactic type of term, but we'll just go with it for now. But the whole reason they're not one of those is simply because these are semi-auto rifles. They're not select fire. So weapons of war are typically going to be select fire, whether that's burst, full auto, or semi-auto. And 99% of the AR-15s out there are going to be semi-auto. Now, you can get special licensing and stuff to, have automatic weapons in the United States, but typically they are very expensive. And again, the whole licensing process, it's a pretty rigorous thing you have to go through in order to be able to own those, okay? So there's a huge difference between something like an off-the-shelf AR, which is what most people buy, even high-end ARs, compared to an actual M4 or even, the MCX Spear that is used today, that was adopted in, 2022 by the U.S. Army. Another common misconception is that this is actually called an AR-15, because it's not. This is actually an M&P 15. Then you'll see FN-15s. You might see rifles like the Springfield Saint or the SIG Tread series, maybe the SIG 516. So you may be thinking, well, what? I thought these were all AR-15s. Well, they're based on the AR-15 platform, but the only company that has the right to actually use the AR-15 name is Colt. So when Armalite, who is the original manufacturer, started going through some financial issues, they actually sold the AR-10 and the rights to the platform to Colt. And it didn't take long for Colt to start capitalizing on this, and in 1964, they began to sell the semi-auto version of the M16, which was the AR-15, to the public. And this was their sporterized version of the rifle. And so for 13 years, they actually had a monopoly on the market, which made the rifles, super popular, but nobody else could use that name. But when time ran up on the trademark, that's when you saw other companies start to make their own versions of the gun, but those companies have to use something other than the AR-15 name. So every single company calls their AR platform something different still to this day, and still to this day, Colt actually makes ARs not only for police and the military, but they make them for civilian use as well. Now, the next common misconception about the AR, and really it's just a fallacy, and it's one that is really disturbing because so many people believe it, is that the AR is the weapon of choice for psychopaths in these mass tragedy events. Now, keep in mind, the AR came on the market in 1964 from Colt, but it wasn't until 2007 when one of these was used by a perpetrator in some kind of mass event. So well before the assault weapons ban and 3 years after that sunset. assault weapons ban, by the way. We're going to explore this a little bit more, but essentially, Bill Clinton, he banned these rifles, but really if a rifle had more than 2 features on it that made it a weapon of war, then it couldn't be produced. So manufacturers just started leaving, this off. They would weld this so you couldn't put any kind of attachment on there, or, magazine restrictions, of course. But all of the previous guns were actually grandfathered in. So it literally had no statistical impact one way or the other on any kind of crime at all. And while this gun has been used in some, heinous types of events, this is where I really blame the media, and it all goes back to one event, which was Columbine. Even though an AR wasn't used, that was still the moment where I feel like the public perception on guns and gun control shifted for a lot of people, because not only did we see this play out in real time, I can remember exactly where I was. Actually, I got home from middle school at the time. So everybody kind of knew where they were, and there was movies and documentaries and documentary after documentary, and so many people have made videos. And I understand one side of the argument, it's like, hey, you don't ever want to forget the victims, and that I agree with. But on the other side, when you keep showing the killers, when you keep showing them, when you make movies about them, when you almost kind of glorify them in a way, copycats are bound to pop up. Every single event where somebody is made famous by the media, somebody else will try to copycat and outdo them or look up to them. And the solution, in my opinion, it may be oversimplified. It's not the only solution to stop these kinds of things, but one big solution is to stop showing the killers altogether. Don't mention their names, don't show their faces, never. Right? Never. And so once you take the publicity away, now it's going to make it really hard for anybody to copycat, because they're going to be like, well, it kind of defeats the purpose, or a big part of the purpose anyways. Plus, another thing to keep in mind is that these events have actually gone down over time. But, and this is widely debated, right? Because some people will, use statistics like, I don't know, somebody had an accident at a school with a gun. They count that as a shooting at a school. Other people are a little bit more realistic when it comes to this whole thing. So I looked at Statista, which looked between 1982 and 2023. They accounted for, I think it was 149 total events, like actual mass events that happened, not just at schools. And they found that 78% of those events actually involved handguns, which makes a lot of sense when you look at the actual statistics between rifles used and, other weapons that are used on a year-to-year basis. So no, this is not the enemy of the American people. And so while these events are super tragic and nobody wants to see them, they've actually gone down over time, and the chances of it happening at a public school are super low when you account for how many schools there are and all of that. Is that hard to tell a parent that's been affected by one of these, or anybody that's been affected by one of these events? Absolutely. But there's things that we can do in order to stop some of this stuff, especially in our schools, making sure that we have police officers at every single school. Also making sure that these police officers have training. Make sure they know the schools in their area, right? We've seen that a number of times where police officers are just standing by, and that is not right. I have respect for a lot of police officers, but at the same time, when you take on that job, the risks. We got to make sure that police officers, have the training, they know the school, they know the layout, but they're also willing to go in there and, make sure that they take care of the threat. And that's just a fact, man. Another thing, metal detectors, whatever we need to do in order to protect the schools. We're not going to get rid of all of these, right? But if we can get rid of a few, BS government programs, or stop sending money all over the frickin' world and actually focus on protecting children and putting that money into the schools to make sure that they are protected. We will protect everything from our money to the president to, everything else that we hold dear, and yet we don't take the same precautions with our most important asset, which is the children in the United States. That is the true tragedy out of all of this. And for the love of God, when these things do happen, stop posting the people. Stop showing their faces. Stop talking about them. You know, it seems like it's more of an agenda, and also it's going to drive ratings too, and they know that. But if you really care, stop showing them. Stop talking about them. And the last misconception that I want to talk about in this video is the fact that these guns are only good for one thing. And considering everything we've talked about in this video, and considering I'm trying to navigate that TOS that we were just talking about, I don't really have to say exactly what a lot of politicians say that these are only good for, and that there's nothing that could be further from the truth. Now, we've already talked about self-defense and how useful these guns can be, but why are they a good self-defense tool? Well, the first reason is they are super easy to shoot. The controls are pretty much standard across the board. Now, there's some manufacturers that will add certain levers that allow you to drop the bolt quicker. Of course, you know, most of the time on your AR, charging handle is up here. Bolt release on the side. Some guns have ambi bolt releases. Some have levers like the MCX series and the Tread series of rifles. Magazine release is right there. And the calibers also make these guns super easy to shoot. So I'm going to move that in just a little bit. And it's a fairly light rifle. Now the 223 and 5.56 is such a soft shooting round that you can take this gun and you can train people on it without scaring them away. I always think of that one clip of that reporter that shoots an AR one time and he starts like just bawling his eyes out, and you know he is totally full of shit, because these things are not that hard to shoot. I mean, you can teach kids, you can teach older people, you can teach younger people, you can teach anybody how to shoot these, because they are, first of all, super reliable guns, assuming that they are built correctly. A lot of people like to do their own builds on these, and you know, they might screw things up. Typically though, off the shelf, good manufacturer, these guns are very reliable. They're also super easy to shoot. They also have a ton of different uses, like we talked about: hunting, self-defense, training tools, competition, long-range shooting, self-defense, home defense. All of these can be used for that purpose, and that's what makes them so great. You can get them in rifle configuration, you can get them in pistol configuration, and you can add as many parts as you want to, or you can keep it super simple like what I've done with this gun. Now typically when I have this thing set up the way I've set it up, is I have a sling on here, I have a dot, I have my vertical grip, and that's it. Now I did change out the charging handle, because stock charging handles on ARs, or mil spec if you will, kind of suck. You know, and there's so many different uses of this gun, but it also is the modern day musket. You know, what a lot of Americans carried during the Revolutionary War, which was their weapon of war at the time. Now a lot of gun owners have these as well. And I'll say this again, and I'll continue to say it because I think it really paints a perfect picture. Do you believe in the Second Amendment and what it was actually written for? If you believe that it is to keep a potentially tyrannical government in check, that's what the Second Amendment is about. Meaning, we should have equal guns as what the military has. Do we have those? No. But we should never be restricted from things like this, because this is the modern day musket, it's America's rifle, and it is a fantastic freaking platform. So there you go, man. There's my opinion on the AR and some crazy common misconceptions about this gun. I'd love to hear about your experience with the AR. What's your favorite platform? Maybe you don't like the AR. Maybe you prefer the AK. If you want to see me do a video on those, I can as well, and take this in a little bit different direction if we go over to the 7.62x39. I think that'd be a pretty cool video too. If you like what I do here, consider subscribing, turn your notifications on, and also if you want to join the SHOT team, you could do that on Patreon or right here on YouTube, and never leave the site, and you guys get some pretty cool perks. Big thanks to you guys. See you in the next one, and as always, hold them down.